La Universidad de la SUAY les da la más cordial bienvenida y agradece su presencia la mañana de hoy en sus jornadas de Conocimiento y Cultura 16.0 online de la Facultad de Ciencia y Tecnología, junto a la Escuela de Biología. Saludamos la presencia de profesores, invitados especiales, estudiantes, quienes nos acompañan esta mañana. El propósito de este espacio es el de compartir y dialogar sobre temas de interés actual y su relación con la sociedad y el momento en el que vivimos. Antes de empezar, aclaramos que todas las preguntas generadas serán respondidas al final de la intervención de nuestro expositor y podrán ser escritas en el chat o reacciones de la plataforma al levantar la mano al terminar la misma. Para dar inicio nos acompaña el ingeniero Andrés López, decano de la facultad, quien nos dará la bienvenida. Adelante, ingeniero.
Ok. Sí, me escuchan, nada más que me confirmen.
Sí, yo puedo.
Ok, sí. Buenos días con todos los presentes en esta charla. En realidad, para la Facultad de Ciencia y Tecnología es un gusto continuar con algo que ya se está haciendo tradición, que son estas jornadas de conocimiento y cultura. Es el cuarto año consecutivo que hacemos las jornadas. Esta es la 16ª jornadas de conocimiento y cultura. Hemos cambiado, lógicamente, a la parte virtual por la situación en la que estamos viviendo, pero bueno, eso nos permite también tener la presencia posiblemente de expositores internacionales, ¿sí? En mayoría de las jornadas que estamos haciendo ahora. Empezamos la semana anterior con la Escuela de Alimentos. Hoy la segunda charla tenemos con la Escuela de Biología, con la participación del profesor Weinstein de la Universidad de Florida. Así que es un gusto compartir con él. Ha sido colega, compañero de nuestro profesor Boris Tinoco. Entiendo que es así el contexto de la invitación que le hemos hecho al profesor Ben. Así es que la idea o el espíritu de estos espacios es que o fue pensado, fue creado para poder compartir el conocimiento o ampliar nuestro conocimiento de los estudiantes, de nuestros profesores, con la participación de profesores y expertos invitados. Como digo, por la situación en la que vivimos, podemos tener esta presencialidad virtual de gente de fuera. Eso ha sido lo bueno. Lo malo, lógicamente, que no podemos tener un contacto personal para tener unas relaciones interpersonales mejores, ¿no? Pero dentro de esto, pues, seguir pensando en que la universidad no tiene que ser un ente aislado, más bien invitar a toda la sociedad, a cualquier profesional para que sigan participando en estas charlas. Vamos a hacer dentro de las jornadas de conocimiento y cultura de la facultad las charlas todos los miércoles. Hoy la segunda charla con la Escuela de Biología. Las siguientes semanas tendremos ingeniería civil y continuaremos así con las 8 escuelas de nuestra facultad. Les invito para que sigan en Facebook la página de la Facultad de Ciencia y Tecnología, en la que constantemente estamos haciendo las publicaciones de estas charlas. Son abiertas, nos interesa que podamos contribuir a la sociedad, no solo en la formación de profesionales, sino en estas conversaciones para ampliar nuestra mente, con la participación de profesores internacionales y expertos de distintas áreas. Así es que les agradezco por la organización a la Escuela de Biología, a nuestra coordinadora de comunicación, Andrea Muñoz, y a todos los asistentes en esta charla. Buenos días y bienvenidos. Disfrutemos de este espacio.
Gracias, señor decano. A continuación, invitamos al doctor Antonio Crespo, coordinador de la carrera de Biología, y es quien nos contará sobre el expositor de la mañana de hoy. Adelante, Antonio.
Muchas gracias, Andrea. Muchas gracias, Andrés. Es un gusto en nombre de la Escuela de Biología de la Universidad de la SUAY tenerte con nosotros, Ben. Ben Weinstein obtuvo su doctorado en Ecología y Evolución de la Universidad de Nueva York. Actualmente es un becario postdoctoral de la Universidad de Florida, en Estados Unidos. Ben estudia los mecanismos que generan, mantienen y preservan la biodiversidad a través del estudio de interacciones de especies, desarrollo de modelos bayesianos para crear predicciones ecológicas y la aplicación de tecnologías de visión computacional y aprendizaje de máquinas para el análisis de imágenes de biodiversidad. Pese a ser un investigador joven, ha publicado en las revistas más prestigiosas en el tema de ecología, incluyendo Ecology Letters, American Naturalist y Ecology. Ben conoce muy bien el Ecuador, pues ha trabajado por varios años estudiando interacciones de colibríes y plantas en el noroccidente de nuestro país. Es un gusto tenerte hoy con nosotros y espero que disfrutes de esta charla y estamos gustosos de conocer un poco más sobre tus investigaciones. Adelante, Ben. Muchas gracias.
Ok, listo. Gracias para la invitación. Yo voy a hablar en inglés y ojalá voy a hablar bien despacio, pero si alguien tiene una cuestión por fin, cualquier idioma está bien conmigo. Okay. I am going to start. Please let me know if anyone can't see anything or everything looks okay, but I think it all looks all right on my end. Thank you for the invitation. I am Ben Weinstein from the University of Florida. I'm going to share with you today some of my work on artificial intelligence for biodiversity conservation. And if you're asked just sort of one sentence to describe what this talk is about, I would say that I hope to convince you today that artificial intelligence can improve the accuracy, scale, and cost of biodiversity conservation using sensor data and machine learning. And there's no reveal here. That's what I hope to explain to you today. And we'll return to this at the end. So what is biodiversity science at its core? Biodiversity science is the process of understanding the conservation and distribution of plants and animals across large spatial scales. And I think a really nice example of biodiversity science leading to applied application in Ecuador was the recently established Andean bear corridor in northern Ecuador in Cotacachi, Cayapas, after many years of analysis by Santiago Molina and many others of the distribution of Andean bears. And at its core, what happened was that researchers went out and made many observations about where bears were found and how we could best protect them. But I think it's worth pointing out here the tremendous amount of field work that went into this project and the tremendous amount of effort it took to get to this place, just finding the animals of interest. Because at its core, observing biodiversity is difficult. It's very hard to find the animals you're interested in. Some may be camouflaged, some may be nocturnal. They may occur in places far away from human habitation. Often they are reticent to be observed by humans. And so we have this essential challenge, which is that we need to determine the distribution, abundance, and behavior of animals, but we have a lack of data given the difficulty in finding them. That's compounded by the fact that field work is expensive. Being in the field means that we're spending dollars that we can't use in other places. And so bringing experts into the field will always be an expensive task. And one of the ways I hope to show you today is that we can decrease the cost by using machine learning and image-based sensors. Access can be difficult. For my work during my PhD, we worked at the Santa Lucia Ecolodge in Pichicha, which was off the grid, which meant that all of our cameras needed to be connected to batteries that were charged elsewhere. We needed to pack everything in on mules and go up the mountain every few days. And so this really limits the amount of time we can be there, as well as, again, the cost of biodiversity observation. That's compounded by the fact that ecosystems are not static. Especially in North America, you'll notice that the vast majority of research was performed between the months of May and August. Not because there is any particular important reason for those months, but that's the time when academics are not teaching. And so we have this contrast between ecosystems changing all the time, but then our own schedules eliminating some periods of time when we can actually go and observe biodiversity. And I think this is a real problem that, again, I hope to show you that machine learning can help us overcome. That's compounded by the fact that expertise is rare. And so the ability for the people you need to identify your organisms to be in the field depends on their schedule and as well as the cost of putting them there. And this really struck me when I was in a meeting last year in Mindo with hummingbird and plant biologists, right? We have people from Ecuador, from Brazil, from France, from Costa Rica, from Colombia, all together. And that was really, great, but it took a huge amount of effort for everyone to come together. And these are the people in Latin America who know hummingbird and plant biology the best. What would be really good is if we could somehow harness their knowledge so they could be available to us forever and all the time, rather than just when we can bring them all together and fly them in to Quito. And so what I hope to convince you today is that machine learning offers us hope that we can use image-based sensors to allow us to develop machine learning models that can reduce the cost of surveys, access expertise easily, and expand the scale of our biodiversity observations so that we can get faster data and make a better applied science. We're really building from developments across fields. Nothing about biology and ecology in specific aren't the challenges we face in machine learning at broader scales. And I think it's really important. One of my big moments a few years ago is when you realize that the challenges we face in biodiversity observation is no different than the challenges we face for self-driving cars, in robotics, in natural language processing. When you start to see the problems that we face and the challenges we face as ones that are really inherent in machine learning, you can start collaborating across fields and really getting a sense for what's possible. And so what I really want to stress to you today is that while some of this might seem difficult, there are computer scientists out there who all day say to me, we don't have data, we don't know what the applied problems are. And so when we start to learn the jargon, when we start to learn the questions that computer scientists have, we can easily collaborate because we start to see that we all have very similar problems in common. I won't be using too much technical language today, but I really want to stress a few different kinds of models we're going to describe and the kinds of tasks we might achieve for image-based biodiversity monitoring. The first is classification. The idea is that we have some object and we're going to give one label to that image. So this is a cat. The entire image gets a label, which is a cat. We might localize that label within a image and say, this is where the cat signal is strongest in that image. We call that classification plus localization. We might determine multiple objects in an image and give them each a bounding box. And we call that object detection. And that's the one we'll talk about most today because that's the work I've been doing the most. And finally, some projects need what's called instance segmentation. And you're assigning a value to every pixel in an image and saying, these are the dog pixels, these are the cat pixels, these are the bear pixels. And so this is an array of machine learning types of models. And so what I stress to people is when you start to think about the kinds of projects you want to do, what task are you trying to achieve at a very simple level? A lot of the growth in machine learning through last 5 years, has really been driven by what are called convolutional neural networks, especially in image-based processing. And so this is sort of the most technical part that I want to try to explain fairly briefly. But basically the idea is that we're going to develop models which are going to evaluate sets of pixels. Those pixels will be reduced into smaller sets of images. So you can think of it as summarizing sets of pixels. Those images are going to be reduced into smaller sets of pixels in this nested structure. And each of these processes is called an image convolution. And so we might convolve this image to create a smaller image that describes that image, do it again and again and again. And we might do these dozens or hundreds or thousands of times. And during that process, we can relate our input data. Here, let's say we're classifying this as a hummingbird to, a butterfly. We can relate that input data to the prediction we want to make, which is the label butterfly. And the model will automatically start to learn the image convolutions which best represent our data. This can be easy to see as a sort of hierarchical model. So data comes in. At the bottom layers, a neural network will learn image pixels that are very, very straightforward. The bottom of a neural network learns things like colors and shapes. And then it learns things like edges, and then object parts. And finally, at the top, it might learn this is a butterfly. And this is really important because it's this hierarchical knowledge that we believe that represents sort of what a human brain does, is that you have this generalized knowledge. You then use that knowledge to build slowly over time. And the great thing about deep learning, as opposed to other types of machine learning that we've used in the past, is that we try to do this automatically. We're going to give the computer a set of images, we're going to give the computer a set of labels, and we're going to ask it to learn hierarchical structures which best explain those images. The general workflow is we take a large set of data that we've collected in the field, for example, camera traps, like in the bear study. We're going to take subject experts who've taken their entire lives to identify and understand these organisms. We're going to have them train data. We'll split data out into training and testing. We use the training data to train the model, the testing data to test the model. And we're going to then measure the uncertainty. So we don't expect the model to be 100% accurate. What we do expect is that we can capture that uncertainty and use it for later inference. And then the virtue of this is that while we're encoding the knowledge based in these subject experts into a model, into those hierarchical structures, we can then use that to predict much larger data sets. So if I say I'm going to label 10,000 images, and I'm going to label each image whether it has a bear or not a bear, because I'm really good at knowing whether an image has a bear or not. Then I might be able to take a model that I've trained, apply it to 1 million images, 10 million images, 100 million images. Scales at which a human could never sit down and do, but because I've encoded my knowledge into a model, I'm able now to expand my prediction and make some inference. For example, where are bears distributed in Pichincha and in Babura? There are some things in our favor that have really grown in the last few years that's really important to highlight, is that data collection from sensor-based sources has gotten vastly easier and vastly less expensive. And so, the ability to collect masses of data is really, for a few $100s, you can get a camera that will take more photos than you could ever possibly process as a human in a lifetime. The drone technology, I'll talk about in a second, has decreased in cost by 1/3 in the last few years. And so our ability to collect data now is really not the problem. Anyone can go out with a drone for $500 and collect masses of data. It's about turning that information into ecological or wildlife labels, which is the challenge. And to sort of show how easy this is, I want to highlight a study I did a few years ago, just showing that drone technology really has taken off in a way that we wouldn't have expected just in 2015. So when I moved to Portland in 2015, I joined a lab at Portland State studying plant genomics. And we wanted to study these prairie plants and understand where they occur within some landscape. And so a traditional way you might do this is to place people in the field and have them count where plants are, and there was 2 bushes over here, and there was 2 trees, this is 50% bare ground. But you would never be able to get a full-scale map of this. So instead we decided to fly a drone over the field and take many, many photographs, stitch those photographs together to make a map, and then use machine learning to delineate 4 categories: tree, swale, hummock, and bush. So we had a person go out and say, this is what a tree looks like, this is what swale looks like, this is what a shrub looks like. Have it predict the whole habitat map. And the really important thing here is that we didn't know how to fly a drone. We spent, I think it was $1,500 on a drone. We didn't know how to do the machine learning. All of it was completely new to us. And the technology has improved to the extent that the drone basically flies itself. I checked last night, the drone we bought went from $1,500 to $600 in the last few years. And so the prices are coming down all the time. And the thing basically flies across the field. You tell it to fly and it goes. And so the ability to sample at these scales is almost trivial at this point. It's in this second step of turning this data into this data where we still need more work. So I got really excited after that study, and it was obvious that computer vision was an area of growth, and it was obvious that an area of desirability within wildlife ecology and biology more generally. And so I wrote a review paper just trying to categorize all the different types of computer vision for ecology papers I could find up into 2016. And so I just come up with sort of 3 categories. We have description, using computer vision to describe what the animal looks like. This might be striping patterns or colors or shapes. We have counting, flying drones or other imagery at broad scales and trying to pick out all the different individuals we see. And then we have identity, things like species classification or individual classification. And over time, we've seen this increase in publication. But what's really cool is that in the last 3 years, this has exploded. I mean, if we were to have done this review paper again, you would see that the number of publications in the last few years has tripled, sometimes every year. I get requests for review now on almost 2 or 3 times a week for computer vision and ecology. And so it really has been this growth and a building of community that's been really rewarding and really exciting. So just to highlight some of the things that are happening just in the last few days to show you what is happening on the ground in computer vision for ecology. I added a couple slides in the last couple of days just because things kept happening. So this is a week in AI for biodiversity science. On Thursday, I got an email from a student in Australia who said that she had collected over 100,000 20-second videos, and could I help her identify her types of rodents in those videos? And I think this is a perfect example of what's happening all the time, is that it's very easy to develop cameras. In fact, she's developed her own cameras to collect huge pieces of data, 100,000 20-second videos, but then have no plan of how to analyze this, right? This is sort of where we are as a field, is that we can collect the data, but then how do we move forward in making that data ecologically interesting? So that was one day. The next day, I got a tweet that people are developing Spanish language camera trap guides. So this is a nice resource if anyone's interested for teaching resources from eMammal for school-based problem-solving education for camera trapping. It was a really nice study, a really nice thing to do, and I highly suggest checking it out. It was really nice. Also this week, I found out that Wild Labs, which is part of the community of artificial intelligence for Earth that I'm part of, has starting a tech tutor episode where they're going to help you train your initial machine learning models. And my point with all of this is that there's this huge growth in what's possible and this huge growth in what's happening just on a daily basis. This all happened since I had finished writing the slides for this talk. And so what I really want to stress to you is that while some of this might seem intimidating, some of this might seem really new, the resources are out there and the community is growing. And I highly suggest just jumping in and getting involved. There are tons of labs. I know several in Colombia, which are doing great work and really focused on Latin America especially. And so this is a really important time for everyone to say, I have data, I have a need, and let's start solving problems. Because at the high level, what we want to do is save human brains, right? We want to avoid that woman sitting there and watching 100,000 20-second clips, because that might take her the rest of her PhD. Or it might take a group of 10 people 100 days. And so we have this belief that human brains are amazing. Let's not waste them clicking on stuff. And what we're trying to do is not replace people, but think of it more as human-computer collaboration. And what I mean by that is there's this narrative in the wider world that it's always humans versus computers, or robots are coming to take our jobs. You hear this all the time. And that couldn't be more false. That couldn't be more not the way to think about it. Instead, think about it as humans collaborating with computers such that computers can perform those tasks which are laborious, which are difficult or dangerous, and allows people to use their amazing brains for what's truly needed. And so what I mean by that is that think about those experts that I showed a slide from before, the hummingbird and plant experts that we flew in from all over Latin America. Wouldn't it be great if we could have access to their knowledge at all points in time? That we could have a model which represents, to the best of that model's ability, what all the hummingbird identification knowledge is in all those people for those thousands of hours they've spent in the field. In some ways, it doesn't matter what the human level performance is, because we're talking about scales that a human could never do. So instead of thinking about this as human versus computer, think about it as how computers can help us scale beyond what humans could do. Because no human should have to sit down and watch 100,000 hours of 100,000 20-second clips. It's just too much data. And so in some ways, it doesn't matter how good of a job that particular person would do. It's about how we can use computers to make that task possible and measure the uncertainty in those collaborations. Another thing that's really exciting that's happened in the last few years is that both ecologists have become aware of the fact that our problems are really similar to wider computer vision and machine learning, as well as machine learning has realized that the problems in ecology are actually really interesting and hard. And so one of the things I really stress to people is that when you have a problem that you think can be solved by machine learning, don't stress how easy it would be for some computer scientists to just come and solve your problem. Stress how hard it would be for a computer scientist. Challenge them and say, this is really going to stretch you. We have lots of really challenging problems. Here's a huge data set. Come work on the hardest thing we can think of. And that's what gets people motivated. Not asking for help, but challenging them to say, this is something that's going to push computer science further. And this has been a really productive set of collaborations I've had with Microsoft Research when we realized that Microsoft was interested in extending its machine learning knowledge, and camera traps was a really important way to go. So this model is not something I've done. This is Siyu Yang and Microsoft Research. And one of the things that you can see from this is that we can now screen out blank images and camera traps very easily because we can draw bounding boxes around animals in those images. So if there's not a bounding box in an image, we can assume that it's blank. And so what Siyu has done is developed a mega detector model from all across the world that will identify individual animals and images and then give them a species label sort of at a high level. It's a bear, it's a dog, it's a cat. But it will tell you what images have animals versus images that don't. And so we're easy to screen out empty sets and camera traps. And this is working at a global scale. You'll see tigers here, you'll see langurs, there's all sorts of things going on here with the chicken. And so there's a lot of things that unite us here across the world in our needs for rapid computer vision screening of biodiversity images. This is all open source. You can go to Microsoft Research and download the mega detector today. You still need some technical knowledge to make it all work. But that's what we're trying to work on, is how to make this available to people at broad scales. Another really exciting set of developments is coming out of the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. Cornell has really been leading the technical revolution here. Merlin is their bird ID app. You can download it for your iPhone or Android today, and you can take photos of birds that are pretty close. I mean, you can't do it far away, but close. And you can download a species identification tool for Latin America. It works pretty well. I tested it out this morning, and it worked pretty amazing for good quality photos. It's a first step towards this human-computer collaboration in the field for species identification at broad scales. BirdNet is an audio analysis engine, which has been really successful in the United States and Europe. I talked to the creator last week, and they are interested in expanding to Latin America. They need more annotated data. So if there are people here who have a tremendous amount of bird identification knowledge, this is an opportunity to share your expertise and train a model so that it can be applied really broadly. And so think about it as you giving your expertise to a broader set of community. So that's sort of a high-level overview of what's happening, what's available at these broad scales. But what does this look like in practice? And so we have this study that I was part of for the last few years on hummingbirds and plants, which was mentioned in the intro. And our goal was very simple. We wanted to detect individual hummingbirds visiting flowers and create ecological networks to understand which birds visited which flowers. But the scale at which we were studying in Pichincha, we had 15 sites, is really challenging, right? We had hundreds of flowers that needed to be sampled, 50 species of hummingbird. Humans sitting at flowers and watching was never going to get it done. And so what I started to develop during my PhD, and what has been extended by obviously Conservación and Tatiana Santander, who I think is here, and Tati can help answer questions about how this works in the field, is a time-lapse camera technique where we'd set up photos, we set up cameras which take a photo every second from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. That's like 43,000 photos a day. We try to get 2 or 3 days per flower, sampling rate about 30 flowers per month. That's a little less these days. But over the history of this project, we've collected more than 100 million photos, easily more than 100 million photos. And so it's not possible for a set of people to ever review those data in a straightforward kind of way. It would not be possible to watch 100 million photos and see which ones have hummingbirds in them. right? Because hummingbirds might only visit once every 3 hours, 4 hours. How are you going to get the data that you need to make the biodiversity decisions you want? And so back in 2015, I developed a fairly crude piece of software called Motion Meerkat. And what it does is it takes in a video and starts comparing frames and say, okay, I don't think there's anything of interest here. I don't think there's anything of interest here. And 2 hours later, it might hit a hummingbird or it might hit a shark in a shark video. And it'll say, I think there's something here. Please review this frame. And so it was a very simple tool to take in a video and output frames of interest. And it was really successful. I mean, I think that members of Aves and Conservación are here today and are, I'm sure, happy to answer questions. But I think it's been a really nice example of how we can use very simple tools to scale up biodiversity observations. So for this project in Ecuador, we've collected almost 33,000 interactions among several hundred species of flowers and over 50 species of hummingbirds. And it's been just this great moment to do really interesting ecology at scales that were not possible before, because you have to spend all of your time in the field staring at flowers, waiting for a bird to arrive. There's been some nice applied work here as well. Tatiana Santander has a long-term study on, obviously, Conservación's plots for black-breasted puffleg, which is a critically endangered species from outside of Quito. And we've really been able to add some observations and some locality information for this species, which is not well known. And again, you wouldn't be able to pay people to spend a lot of time in the field looking for this really rare species. But if you're doing it as part of a very large study, you might opportunistically find, oh, there's a black-breasted puffleg. Great, let's study that. And so by the fact that we have these camera sensing arrays, we can expand our knowledge about what's out there. And so I released this software and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. And it was really amazing. We developed a pretty good user base. People from all over the world started downloading it for butterflies, for sharks. This image is several years old. It's been 1,000 downloads at this point from all sorts of continents. There are download locations for Motion Meerkat. So much so that I went back and tried to redesign it so that the first step was just identifying objects of interest in that frame. So we had some background model, it's some function, it's not literally a subtraction, but some background model, some current frame, which could give you the motion object. And then we could feed that into a neural network, which says, oh, given negative samples and given positive samples, we think this is a butterfly. And we could train this model for all sorts of things. And that was really cool. And we've gotten some new money to redesign this. And this was the first step towards my knowledge about how this was all going to work. But there is some challenges to the Ecuador project that I think are still there, right? Is that you still need researchers to go into the field and place cameras. And it takes a lot of time. And it's not going to get you the scale we want for example, continent-wide challenges or country-wide challenges or global challenges. And so I took a postdoc in the University of Florida to start studying trees because I think that there's a real opportunity to use these kind of tools to make really broad-scale inference. And so what I mean by that is that over the last few years, a lot of data has been collected on airborne tree surveys through the National Ecological Observation Network, NEON as we call it. So NEON has been flying at 40 sites around the continental US, collecting enormous geospatial tiles. So each of these little tiles in here is 1 square kilometer, and one site might be 400 tiles. We can crop those down to see individual trees. And our goal here is just like the butterfly example. We want to draw a bounding box around individual trees. And I think we should contrast this to how normally we go out in the field and sample this. This is my son out in the backyard measuring trees. And this is normally how it's done. I mean, not usually with toddlers, but all the same, is that you go out and you put a tape measure around, you say, this is one tree, it's this big, I'm gonna give it a species ID. And you could imagine that it's not possible to do this for truly enormous scales, because there's only so many toddlers in the world willing to go out and measure trees. But using sensor data, we can start gathering information at much broader scales. So I'm going to talk briefly about NEON's data. Some of you might be familiar with some of these data products. It'll be a pretty high-level overview. But we have RGB data, which is just cameras flying from fixed-wing aircraft, filming the ground. We have hyperspectral data in the infrared spectrum, beyond the visible spectrum. And then we have LiDAR. LiDAR is an active remote sensing technique. You can think of it as a laser being shot down to the ground and measuring that response time back. by measuring the time between when you shot the laser and when you return the laser, you can make point clouds for a structure. And from that, we can see individual trees. And so this task involves trying to identify where individual crowns are. We're not dealt with species labels yet. We just are trying to draw bounding boxes around individual trees. And so we did this at one site, a fairly easy site, and it was a pretty good first result, which I won't show. What I will show is sort of our next step, is how we took this to the bigger scales. Because NEON, these are an example of all the NEON sites. NEON has been collecting this RGB, LiDAR, and hyperspectral data for huge areas. So if we did develop a tree model that could predict individual trees, we could apply it to massive areas. And so that's what we did. If you have questions about the technical aspects here, I'm happy to talk about semi-supervised deep learning. But I think given this talk, I think it's important to think about the results rather than the methods. And so we've developed a tree identification model, or say a tree detection model, that compared to image annotation, so compared to me drawing bounding boxes on an image, is 73% accurate and 70% precise. Each of these panels is an example of a forest from across the United States. So this is the abbreviation. This is Tea Kettle Canyon, California. This is Ordway Swisher, Florida. And so what you can see is this one model works on a really flexible set of geography. And we are really excited about sharing this model with a large group of people. And so what it does is that you take in an RGB data, and it's going to predict to you these bounding boxes for each of the tree locations it finds. I don't want to overstate this in the sense that 73% is good, but not great, right? Like it's a start. And so we continue to work from here, but it allows us to scale at, broad sections of the country that we can never get by hand. And this is what I sort of go back to that human-computer collaboration. In some ways, it doesn't matter what a human could do clicking on boxes, because you can never get a human to click on 1 million boxes, 10 million boxes, or 100 million boxes. And so we've done this now. We've taken our model and predicted all of NEON's data archive. These are actually vast underestimates of the size. So let's say we had 25 sites, 200 tiles per site, we have about 3 years of data. We actually have closer to 4, 15,000 trees. That's about 200 million individual trees. And so we've done this, it's already done. We are releasing this data to the public so that people can have access to 200 million individual tree crowns. And it's actually an underestimate. For 1 year, we're at 115 million individual tree crowns. And with that, you get the spatial location of the tree, the estimated size, the crown area, and then from the LiDAR, because we know the height above ground, we can get the tree height. And so while these predictions might not be perfect, they're the first step towards continent-wide tree surveys facilitated by machine learning and computer vision. We have a Shiny app available for you to test out, as well as I've released the model as a Python package for anyone to use on their own data. So you can download the Python package and run it against your RGB data and make tree predictions. A lot of you are saying, well, how does that work in the tropics? How would that work in Ecuador? And the truth is that we don't really know. We don't have a ton of tree information from plots in Ecuador. We have one study from French Guiana where they had hand-labeled trees and then gone into the field and tried to measure the trees that were there. And we were 70% accurate on the overstory trees. And this should be somewhat obvious in the sense that machine learning isn't magic. We can't identify and detect trees that we cannot see. And so while we're 78% accurate for those overstory trees, of course, there are all sorts of trees under the canopy that we can't see. And so we have to take that uncertainty and try to apply it for where we want to make ecological or biodiversity observations, given the fact that we know there's trees you're not going to be able to see. And so one of the things I want to stress to people, again, is it's not humans versus computers. It's computers enabling us to do things that we couldn't do otherwise. It's not solving problems as much as opening new avenues. Another area of really interesting development is in that infrared. So I talked about LiDAR and talked about RGB, but the hyperspectral data is really cool as well. So some of you might know this, but on the left-hand side is an RGB image, a camera image of a forest. On the right-hand side is the same image, but in the hyperspec, beyond the visible human spectrum in the infrared. And what's happening here is because trees through chlorophyll capture red light, they all reflect back the green, which is what you see in the eye. they also reflect back infrared because each tree is different efficient at capturing through chlorophyll and through photosynthesis. And so different tree species reflect differently in the infrared. And in fact, they are more different from each other in the infrared than they are in the RGB. So to a person flying over a forest, it might all seem green, but it's possible through the infrared that you can tell more difference among trees. And it's been shown that tree species prediction is much better in the infrared than it is in RGB. And so we are working right now on a smaller scales, not all 200 million crowns, but on millions of crowns for one site to do species prediction that we will associate with those labels. And so it's a really exciting new area of work. So the last thing I'll share is that, how can we quickly bring these developments to new applications? As I said, this can be really intimidating. When I started, I didn't know any of this stuff. And so, I was a bird biologist who liked hummingbirds, right? And so how do we make this possible to be used at broad scales? You're not going to be able to develop a brand new model for every type of thing. Why should a shark researcher start from nothing? A bear researcher start from nothing? Instead, what I hope to show you is that we can build from models that have already been developed to apply them very quickly. So I want to share one project that we've just started in the last 2 weeks. So these are brand new results, but it's really exciting. And so this is machine learning in support of environmental restoration. This will make sense in a second. Many of you will know that in the southern United States, the state of Florida has a large wetland called the Everglades. During the 1940s and earlier, the Army Corps of Engineers dammed up a major water system in the Everglades, changing the water flow. And so what used to be a seasonal wetland at the bottom of Florida is now drying out. And this has had really negative repercussions for wildlife populations, as well as hurricane and storm damage. And so the Army Corps of Engineers is actually trying to reverse what it did in the first place by reestablishing a flow plan. So breaking down the dams and breaking down the rivers and trying to get the water to flow back towards the normal Everglades system. And during that process, the Fish and Wildlife has established specific target goals for wildlife recovery as a measure of environmental restoration. And specifically, they want to see bird nesting rates increase based on the water flow. And so we've just started this project studying birds and the Everglades and understanding how it works. And so this is a recording from a recent expedition out into the Everglades. These are the systems that we're studying. And what we're going to do is fly drones over these bird colonies and try to count individual birds in the image. And then try to assess this over time as the Everglades restoration increases. And so, we have this challenge, right? Is how do we build a bird model quickly, given that we don't have a lot of data? We just started this 2 weeks ago. Well, we can utilize the fact that neural networks are hierarchical. This is why I showed that slide in the beginning, is that the bottom layers of neural networks learn things like color. The middle layers learn things like edges. The top layers learn things like objects. And up here, it might learn things like trees. So if we already have a model which learns things about trees, maybe we can just use this part of the model to learn things about birds, cut off this top part, stick on 2 new nodes, and train it with a little bit of data. It's already learned things about colors and edges and objects. It can maybe learn data about birds very quickly. And so that's exactly what we did. This is called transfer learning. It's quite well established in machine learning. And so within 3 days of annotation, rather than years of a hummingbird or years of tree annotation, we were able to develop a model very quickly to study drone inferred bird nesting rates in the Everglades. So this is from last week. We have a model that compared to human annotation is 89% accurate and 74% precise. And given the difficulty of this image, I think it's really impressive that this was only done with, I think, like 3,000 boxes. It took like 2 people half a day to annotate this, whereas it took us years to get to where we are with trees. And so by starting from a tree model and saying, forget about trees, but remember the fact that like we have objects, their colors and shapes, let's learn about birds now, we can start from a much stronger place and share these models really widely so that all researchers don't have to start from the beginning. And with that, I'm gonna turn it back over to the moderators. I hope I've convinced you that artificial intelligence can improve the accuracy, scale, and cost of biodiversity conservation using sensor data and machine learning. Thank you. I see clapping.
Agradecemos.
Adelante, Andreita, perdón.
No te preocupes. Agradecemos la presencia de Ben. Bueno, inmediatamente iba a dar paso a las preguntas de los asistentes.
Perfecto, gracias, Andrea. Tenemos en el chat una pregunta para Ben. No sé si estás viendo el chat, Ben, pero ahí hay una pregunta para responderle. Adelante.
Solo había una. I think in the chat, I only see one question, which is from Boris. Nadie más. Ok, bueno. Boris y yo hablamos. La cuestión es, Ben, ¿en cuántos años crees que podamos tener un estimado de cuántos árboles existen en la Amazonia? ¿Cuál es tu predicción? Pues, bueno, yo voy a responder en inglés, pero quizás yo puedo hacerlo en español también. I think there's two things to think about. At the highest level, it's like, what can we actually observe, right? And so if we're talking about large overstory trees, then yes, I think that, there we go, stop sharing screen. I think that we can get predictions at broad scales very, very quickly. Whether those are going to be enough for biodiversity assessments at broad scales, I don't know. Things like deforestation surveys could be done very quickly using fixed-wing aircrafts at broad spatial scales. And this is already being done in Colombia. In the Colombian Amazon, there's been quite a bit of work on deforestation through fixed-wing aircraft. And so just measuring individual trees in that area and saying, are they here between years? We're never going to get to things we can't see, but at that broad scale, saying there's a relationship between the number of trees you can see and what we think's there based on some model, I think that's really possible, and I think it could happen soon. We can't yet do this from satellite data. It still needs to be fixed-wing aircraft. So there is some limitation to how far and how much data we can collect. But I've been told that satellite data is increasing in resolution all the time. And I actually think it's mostly a political thing and a military thing. The hardware for better satellites for higher resolution right now is limited by what is legal to observe and not what's technically possible. And so, for example, we know in the Antarctic, where the American military has released satellite imagery, it is 10 times what we have from Google Maps, for example. And so we know the technology's out there, and we know that companies are moving towards that. There is a political nature and a privacy nature, right? Because you could point that satellite at all sorts of things, not just the Amazon. Okay, I'm going to take more questions here.
Solo una indicación para todos los participantes. Si desean hacer preguntas, ya está el chat habilitado para que pongan sus preguntas en el chat, ¿sí? Tenemos un par de preguntas aquí. Primero, tenemos bastantes. Primero, Diego Pacheco.
Ahora tenemos, sí.
Sí, que es como uno de nuestros GI experts de la Universidad de la SOAI, pregunta si es que para el entrenamiento computacional de estos modelos, ¿cuál es la arquitectura computacional que se recomienda? Vamos a comenzar con eso y iremos bajando a las siguientes. You can answer in English, don't worry.
Okay. I'm thinking about what you really mean by architecture. So like, we've been using Keras Retina nets with just standard laptops and GPUs. And so what I really recommend to people is just to go to GitHub and type in object detection Python or object detection R, whatever programming language you're most comfortable in, and say, use what's available to you already, because there's tremendous open source work right now is that you don't have to start from scratch. And there's actually a lot of Spanish language guides. There's a lot of work being done out of Spain, out of Colombia, that really have made this available to a large audience. And so a good place to start is just to type in Keras RetinaNet, and you can get an object detection model within 10 minutes. It really has been a huge amount of development. Great talk. I'd like to hear about the sources of uncertainty or errors that we get from this model and techniques. What are acceptable rates? How do we improve accuracy and precision? That's a great question. We want to move away from the idea that things are either true or false. and think about more as the likelihood that we have some information of interest. So think about as if we're 73% accurate with a tree, and then we count some big, large area, we can measure the likelihood that our model is 73% within the confidence interval of our true statement. And so there's a lot of development here in the Bayesian statistical world to associate our model uncertainties with downstream ecological processes. And so what I really suggest people is not thinking about it as I have 25 jaguars in my camera trap data set, but there's the probability I have 25 jaguars in my camera trap data set is 90%. And while that might be harder to think about, it's more accurate and allows us to think about associating the uncertainty with downstream processes. And so I think there's a role here for Bayesian statistics as a really fundamental tool for connecting machine learning to ecological studies. We also know that we can study which things are being confused. So if you have a confusion matrix, you can then say there's more uncertainty between identifying jaguars and ocelots versus jaguars and peccaries. And so trying to propagate the kinds of uncertainty that you have in your model to the downstream analysis is really important in saying we think there's some probability distribution here. Hola, Ben. Saludos de Peru. Wow, we have someone from Peru. Hello, Peru. Esto es algo interesante. You know, it's not too hard to develop new models. It's about finding the right data. And so I would say at the highest level, the thing that's really important is making sure you're annotating your data in a way that's attractive. The modeling part of it, in truth, is that you can Google and find out this stuff really easily. It's about getting the data in the right organization. So what I would suggest for everyone's project is thinking about, as you're annotating, before you start organizing your data, think about the kinds of models you want in the end. Do I want a bounding box model? Do I want a classification model? Do I want an instance segmentation model? And developing your data organization strategy before you start annotating. Because what you often find is that people annotate their data set, and then they get, and they're like, I want to develop a model, but the way they annotated it doesn't actually work. And so thinking early in that process is actually much easier than the actual model development itself. A lot of the models I've shown you are pretty easy to use. It's about getting the data and annotating it, which is the hard part. We have from Gisela de la Cadena Mendoza. Congratulations, awesome talk. Do you think you can use AI for other taxonomic groups, such as terrestrial and aquatic insects? Yes. And in fact, we have money from Switzerland to start doing that. And so there are already studies in Europe on terrestrial and aquatic insects under microscopy images. And again, it's the same exact idea. We want to draw bounding boxes and count individuals of certain species in an image. And so I would really stress that looking online, and there's a lot of development here, there's no reason why this can't be applied to microscopy or all sorts of other areas. Because as you see, our challenges are all the same. And so even the biomedical literature, people, for example, identifying cancer tumors, this has been a really popular area under electron microscopies. And so there's a lot of really strong connections because the algorithm doesn't know what you're studying. It doesn't know it's a bird. It just knows there are sets of pixels that you want it to see. And so if you want to train it on microscopy images, I think it's totally possible. Manuel Sanchez and Isabella. Ben, the problem is, doesn't apply here. The main problem is the digital and technical. Yes, absolutely. At some point, you have to teach the machines about the future of natural history and science. That is a big umbrella. Absolutely. And that's sort of what I mean about getting the experts in the right places and then trying to apply that. The data collection process is so important and the data annotation process is so important that you're right. The training of the model is somehow at the back end of it. It's about getting the right people and doing it in the setup that is rigorous, that allows us to have the kind of technical expertise, because you can find someone to train your model, but only so many people know how to identify 50 species of hummingbirds and then organize in the right way and have the access to the data. And so long-term, I've been working with Microsoft Artificial Intelligence for Earth, which is a large collaborative, to start building these technical resources so that people without the computational resources can upload them in the cloud. And so I highly suggest people look up AI for Earth, which has a grant program for Latin America especially, that allows people to upload data and store in the cloud. Because you're right, the technical resources and the technical expertise for the model development is a lot easier than a lot of the other sociological challenges we have to get there. That's totally true. Wow, I'm no way I'm gonna get to all these questions. There's a lot going on here. I'm just going in order here. Thank you for the nice presentation. From your experience for species discrimination, is there a relationship to the minimum amount of observations and number of classes used for techniques using deep learning? Absolutely. So, starting with the transfer learning paradigm, don't start from a blank model. Start from something that you believe in, so that you've seen it work pretty well. So if you've developed a model on trees, start from trees, and then you can apply it to birds. You know, a few hundred images on their own are not going to do it. But if you have a model that performs pretty well and you have a few hundred diverse images, that might actually work. We've shown that transfer learning is really possible at really fast scales. But training from scratch with just a few hundred images or even a few thousand images is never going to happen. These deep learning models have millions of parameters, tens of millions of parameters, which means that they overfit quite quickly. And so you can train it on 300 images of your new organism, but all it means is it's going to memorize every single pixel in your images. And so it's just going to spit back to you exactly what those pixels look like. And what we mean by that is it means it's just not generalizable. And so the data, as I said here again and again, the data is the key part, and the organization is the key part, and starting from models which are already well developed rather than starting from scratch.
Ben,
I also would say that start with a few number of classes at first, not a lot of classes at first.
Ben, we have another 5 or 7 minutes. So
I'm sorry, I don't know.
No, that's okay. Just I would recommend just choosing which couple of
fast.
questions more you want to answer. Go ahead, please.
Sorry. All right, I'll throw through. I won't answer Tatiana because she can write me later. La información de sala y recomiendas. You know, the public data question from Brian is a really interesting one, right? And so there's a whole question of privacy and natural history and you know, intellectual property rights, which I think are really important here, and that I think is getting glossed over. And that you can think of it as like, right, the genetics community has gone through this in a different process than the machine learning community, for example. So like if you take a specimen for some animal from Ecuador, you need to deposit in an Ecuadorian natural history museum and then request for permits to take it out of the country, for example, for genetic surveys. The same is not really true with image data. And so I think that Latin American countries have to start thinking about their intellectual property here in the same way they think about their genetic property, is that if we're going to train models from Latin America, we need to insist that those data be open and made available to Latin Americans. And so I think that this, you know, this question of data availability and whose data is it that's available to the public is a really important one, and a role that I think that as Y can play, the universities can play in saying that if you're going to collaborate with us, if you're going to come with us, we expect that there's be some public repository of that data, just the way that genetics does. And so I think that will help make that available rather than, you know, the same kind of imperial idea of Americans coming in, doing some machine learning study and leaving. And so I think that there's a public good here that has the same kind of value. Okay, I can see that Antonio says that I should stop soon, so let me do one more. Let's look at fun. All right, Francisco asked with unbalanced classes. Unbalanced classes is a great question. There's a couple technical resources here that you should look up. One is called focal loss. That's really important. So the idea here is that lots of images are easy to identify. Some images are hard. If you use a loss statistic that says evaluate all the images equally, and so you train a model, it's really good at identifying some images, that's great, and it treats them all equally. That leads to unbalanced challenges. There is something called a focal loss, which says, hey, you were really good at predicting that image last time, only focus on the really hard images now. And so you'll see that your loss statistic drops really slowly because you're penalizing the easy images and prioritizing the hard images. And that helps you find rarer classes. At the end of the day, more data is always good, but using focal loss can help you for unbalanced classes, as well as artificial and synthetic subsampling. And if we have more questions about that, I don't think this is the moment for that, but I'm happy to talk more by email about semi-supervised deep learning and handling unbalanced classes. Okay, do I have one last one, Antonio, or am I done? I don't know if
Yes,
thumbs up
go
is
ahead.
done.
Go ahead. You can have one
Never
more.
know.
That's fine. Go ahead.
Oh, yeah. So here's one from Francisco that's really nice about educational development. So one of the things that's really cool about machine learning is this natural training loop idea, right? And so you can have people who know about their classes of interest. I'm a bear researcher, and I know a lot about bears. But you also can have the public get involved through education. And so I would really recommend looking at Zooniverse, which is an online web platform for photo and image annotation. And they have a kind of gamification structure. And in fact, the bird drone imagery I showed you was identified on Zooniverse. While it's not available to the public yet, it will be available soon. And so anyone could go on and learn a little bit about wading birds and the Everglades. And during that process, click on some boxes and say, these are my objects of interest. And so it's sort of a collaboration between the education, providing that data and that interest, as well as that annotation process. And so citizen science has been shown a really exciting way of collaborating between the public and training machine learning models at the same time. And I think Zooniverse is really a great opportunity for that. Not to mention that there are a lot of experts out there, not just academics, people who know their natural history, local people who know their natural history incredibly well. And so getting those technical resources, as that other question mentioned, is super hard. But when we can get those technical resources, using that local knowledge is so valuable because annotated data is scarce. Okay, I think that's all the questions I'm supposed to take. Lee is going to send me an email because she knows my email. Gracias.
Great. Ben, I want to thank you on behalf of Escuela de Biología, Facultad de Ciencia y Tecnología, and Universidad de la SUAY for sharing your time, expertise, and innovative ideas with all of us. It's been a pleasure to hear you, to have this new information with us. We hope to hear more about you in the future. So to all of our participants, we had over 100 participants during the talk. So thank you everyone for listening, for tuning in. Gracias a todos por estar aquí en esta charla. Agradecemos nuevamente a Ben por todo su tiempo y su esfuerzo en esta charla. Muchísimas gracias. Esperamos verte pronto, Wayne, por aquí. Esperamos verles a todos también pronto. Muchas gracias y una buena tarde para todos.
Gracias.